From the time of the gold rush, San Francisco teachers have championed public education, fought for their workplace rights, and gone the extra mile for their students. In 1855, pioneer Clara Walbridge told her mother in a letter that she was studying Spanish outside of school hours because most of her students didn't speak English. Later in the 19th century, Irish immigrant Kate Kennedy, a teacher and later a principal, filed a landmark lawsuit against the San Francisco School District for paying women less than men doing the exact same work. There were no public education unions. Teachers could join local chapters of the National Education Association, but in an occupation mainly comprising women and teachers, the organization was controlled by male administrators, superintendents, and school board members. Teachers had little or no voice in their occupation. That is why the American Federation of Teachers was founded in 1916. And 3 years later, in May 1919, San Francisco teachers founded AFT Local 61, the San Francisco Federation of Teachers. Later that year, the new union hosted the first meeting of the California State Federation of Teachers. The San Francisco teachers founded Local 61 because of their willingness, their wish to be affiliated with labor. There were many organizations of teachers in San Francisco, but from 1918, when the first local was formed in Vallejo, the watchword was really, you can't get anything done unless you're affiliated with labor.
More than half a century would pass before the goal of a collective bargaining law was achieved. In the meantime, Local 61, growing slowly, represented teachers in lawsuits, organized political and legislative action, and worked with the San Francisco Labor Council to secure tax revenues and create better schools.
Before collective bargaining, you've heard the term collective begging, and that's what we had.
Employees didn't have any voice, any choice in the matter in terms of how the conditions would be working in San Francisco. That all changed after collective bargaining.
We had nice conversations, but they had no strength to them. They were unenforceable. After collective bargaining, we had a contract that was legally enforceable.
In 1960, New York teachers electrified public education unionists around the country by going on strike and gaining state legislation to guarantee collective bargaining rights. They were the first.
What was being fomented in the broader society were these bigger issues, the war, the civil rights, the farm workers, whatever you wanted to call it. Therefore, there was a sense of righting wrongs. It wasn't hard to apply that to your own working conditions, your own union.
In 1966, in Richmond, teachers and classified employees opened the school year with the first ever public education strike in California over pay and equitable allocation of district resources to majority black schools. 2 years later, the movement spread to San Francisco.
I am convinced that once the teachers assert their power and assert leadership in the community and make their position clear and known, that the people of San Francisco, with their usual generosity, will come to our support.
Strikes of teachers are illegal. It jeopardizes the safety and welfare and health of children.
It was just a one-day strike, but it had a huge impact. Jim Ballard, a World War II veteran and former auto worker, succeeded community college instructor Al Tapson as Local 61 president in 1967, and immediately began to organize the membership for a strike.
Jim really brought militancy into the union. Not that people weren't militant to start with, but Jim really fostered it and organized people so that they could express that militancy. It was under Jim that all 4 of the strikes that were held in San Francisco were carried out.
Contrary to anything you have heard, we have not gone beyond our regular substitute list.
We have every teacher in our building absent today. 16 of us are on the picket line.
Who's teaching classes?
We have substitutes from I don't know where. We've never seen them before.
The propaganda in the schools was, now that you're going to become a teacher, you're going to be a professional, and professionals don't join unions and they don't strike and blah, blah, blah. So I drank the Kool-Aid and I'm crossing the picket line. I come home and my mother finds out that I had not been on the line but crossing the line, and she said, not if you live in this house. So I joined the union. One of our issues of our first strike was we wanted more minority teachers. And we got the district to agree to a quota for minority teachers to get more diversity into the city.
The union won a district-paid dental plan and lowered class sizes with an agreement to hire 300 teachers on an affirmative action basis.
I remember Jim saying that if all the teachers of San Francisco walked down to Powell Market and dropped a pencil on the sidewalk at the same time, they wouldn't need to do anything else. And I think that was the day we dropped our pencils on the sidewalk, and they reverberated for some years.
Ballard led the union on 2 more largely successful strikes in 1971 and 1974. At the same time, Ballard worked with paraprofessionals to form the first AFT unit of classified employees in California in 1972.
We didn't really have a contract or anything. Paras were like mothers in a school site, and they really didn't have many rights. Now, after collective bargaining, since I've been doing, they have a lot of rights. They're parallel a lot to the teachers.
After we affiliated with AFT, there was an enormous difference in the administration's attitude because we had solidarity with teachers and were no longer alone in advocating for ourselves.
In the mid-1970s, the long struggle for a collective bargaining law led since the 1950s by the California Federation of Teachers finally met success. After former San Francisco Mayor George Moscone's bill passed the legislature in 1974, it was vetoed by then-Governor Ronald Reagan. But the following year, with Jerry Brown in the governor's office, collective bargaining for public education workers became the law of the land. Across the state, representation elections were held in school districts, triggering battles between AFT and NEA affiliates. In San Francisco, AFT Local 61 won the first election in 1977 with high expectations for negotiating a good contract. We celebrated with a great party.
But the passage of Prop 13 in 1978 crippled the state's ability to raise school revenues. In 1979, the San Francisco Unified School District Administration laid off 1,200 certificated and classified workers, forcing a 6-week strike.
Prop 13 actually acted like a guillotine. It just dropped down and it cut off everything that we had known before.
The district forced us out by laying people off, and then instead of bringing them back in the order called for under then current law and so forth, they fired everybody with 10 years of less seniority, and they were bringing them back not as tenured teachers but as long-term substitutes. We stayed out an extra week on that point alone.
1979 and the strike in 1979 split the entire district apart. You had teachers on either side in hallways who would not speak to one another afterwards. It was a disastrous sort of thing.
One of the most significant consequences of the strike was that it was a Pyrrhic victory, in a sense. The Local 61 was able to hold back some of the cutbacks, but the process of the strike, the length of the strike, the bitterness of the strike had a major impact upon morale. And shortly after that, the Local 61 lost bargaining rights.
The real problem with having two unions was that you could hardly accomplish anything because the Board of Education could always play you off one against the other. And that is the reality that we faced throughout from 79 through 89 as collective bargaining elections went back and forth.
It was ridiculous considering that teachers have real enemies out there and they're not other teachers. And so, you know, burying the hatchet was the only sensible thing to do.
Finally, in 1989, Local 61 won yet another election with the promise to negotiate a merger of AFT and NEA affiliates.
I can remember writing the letter to Judy Delamonica, the president of San Francisco Classroom Teachers Association, saying, and now can we talk about a merger? And to my very pleasant surprise, I, within a short period of time, got a very nice letter back that said in essence, yes.
Throughout the 1990s and 2000s, California education unions were forced to play defense. UESF negotiated hard, coming close to striking more than once.
This is a very momentous occasion because the teachers might be voting for a strike, and it hasn't happened since 1979. And here we're going to have teachers, paraprofessionals this time, that will be organized, giving authorization to the executive board to go out on strike.
There were a few people in Sacramento that understood how funding came to the districts, but as a classroom teacher, all you ever knew is you didn't have enough. And during that time, you really did not have enough.
I was hired 7 or 8 years after Prop 13 was passed, and I came into a school district and a school system where there was no music, there was no PE, class sizes were over the roof, there was no nurse on my school site, and that was the backdrop to my teaching.
The good thing with merger, once it happened in 1989, we were then able to mobilize not only our own organization, combined 7,000 people, but also with other labor unions in San Francisco, with parent groups, PTA groups, and with students. We went to Sacramento many, many times to lobby the legislature, to have rallies, to make the point that education funding had to be a priority.
There were many days like this one when UESF rallied in San Francisco, the same day as rallies throughout the state for education funding. As tech corporations moved into the Bay Area, politicians gave them tax concessions, increasing economic inequality, traffic congestion, and creating skyrocketing costs for housing.
To counteract the underfunding of public education in California, UESF has been involved in every state level and local level campaign to increase funding for public education. At the state level, together with our parent union CFT and community partners, UESF participated in a millionaire's tax movement in 2011 and 2012. Ultimately, we passed Prop 30 in 2012.
Californians overcame decades of anti-tax sentiment and approved the first general tax in 20 years.
So Proposition 30 is a unifying force, and we had to overcome a lot of obstacles. We overcame them.
And Prop 55 in 2016.
Help our children thrive. Yes on 55.
Which brought in billions of dollars each year for public education through an income tax increase on the richest Californians.
Prop G was a partial tax that was passed by the voters in June 2018, which brought to all our members close to an extra 7% increase in their wages, which is enormous on top of the 11% that we had bargained for in the prior year. This is make or break for people in San Francisco, make or break for para-educators, make or break for social workers and teachers, and it was a sign of hope.
But even these tax increases have not been enough to overcome decades of underfunding. Much more remains to be done before San Francisco's education system can provide the education all its students deserve.
San Francisco, why the teachers union here in the city says teachers are leaving in droves. Details coming up.
So the underfunding of education affects our students in particular because many of the students come from marginalized communities that have been really underserved, whose families haven't been supported throughout their generations, whose families work in very difficult circumstances, very low-paid jobs. And so then when they come to school, they already come under-resourced. When we come to school, and on top of that, you have that background, but then you have a school environment where you don't have the materials you need, you don't have a stable staff because you can't pay educators enough to live in this expensive city.
The income disparity in San Francisco has grown tremendously, and we now see students who are homeless, about 2,000 of them in this school district, and we see educators who actually live in their cars.
Underfunding public education has personally affected me in that I had to leave the city in 2015. I've been working in SFUSD since 2011, and I work in the southeast of San Francisco. So living in the city was the most conducive to my commute situation. But now I live in Oakland. That was the only place I could find an apartment within 60% of my paycheck. And now my commute is anywhere between 1 to 3 hours a day, depending on if I can carpool with folks. And I'm on the very edge of my living expenses.
I am currently in the paraprofessional teacher training program. A lot of my colleagues have quit. We are not being paid fair wages. 50% of my income goes to my rent. I'm asking for an increase in fair wages and not to be booted out of San Francisco, and we should live within the communities that we teach.
I'm hopeful about public education in San Francisco because things are changing, and a lot of that can be credited to our strong union, United Educators of San Francisco.
UESF is a place where you can bring some what used to be very radical ideas to the table and discuss how those things benefit the least of us and the most of us all at the same time.
Local 61 has been fighting for our members for 100 years, and the one lesson that stands out for me about that is that persistence works.
That has been the history of the AFT in San Francisco. It has been willing to be involved in housing, in income inequality, in immigration, in all kinds of issues that affect our teachers, our students, and their parents. And I think it's been an active involvement.
The lessons that I take away from the 100 years of struggle by AFT and other unions is that it really requires our participation. It's taken 100 years for stories like Cesar Chavez, Dolores Huerta, to allow opportunities for people like me. And if we're going to provide our children a better future where these issues of inequality are resolved, then it might take another 100 years, but we're going to do that with labor.
What is the impact of underfunding on you in your life?
Like personal?
Yes,
or?
personal.
Okay.
Like, when are you buying that house in San Francisco?
That's funny. Okay.